Section 1. The Setup. What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors walks into what he thinks is a friendly late-night interview, only to find himself trapped in a carefully orchestrated ambush designed to destroy his reputation on live television? What happens when the host, someone trusted by millions of viewers every night, decides to use his platform not to entertain, but to personally settle scores and push his own agenda, regardless of who gets hurt in the process? Tonight, we're diving deep into one of the most shocking moments in late-night television history. A moment that revealed the true character of someone millions of Americans invite into their homes every single night. A moment that showed just how far a host will go when the cameras are rolling and the audience is watching. Make sure you subscribe and let me know in the comments what you think really motivated this attack, because what you're about to hear will change how you see late-night television forever. It started like any other taping of The Late Show. The audience was buzzing with excitement. The cameras were positioned perfectly, and Stephen Colbert was preparing for what his producers had promised would be a light-hearted conversation with Matt Damon about his latest film project. But something was different that night. Something had shifted in Colbert's demeanor during the commercial break before Damon walked out. The production team noticed it first. Colbert's usual pre-show banter with the crew was replaced by an intense focus, a quiet intensity that made everyone on set uncomfortable. His assistant later described it as watching someone prepare for battle rather than conduct an interview. The script that had been approved hours earlier was nowhere to be seen, replaced by handwritten notes that Colbert kept close to his chest, refusing to share with anyone, including his own producers. When Matt Damon walked onto that stage, he was expecting the kind of interview he had done hundreds of times before. A few jokes about his latest movie, maybe some playful ribbing about his Boston accent, and then a smooth transition to the film clip that would help promote his project. He had no idea that Stephen Colbert had spent the afternoon researching not his latest film, but every controversial statement Damon had ever made, every political position he had ever taken, and every personal detail that could be weaponized for maximum damage. The audience gave Damon the warm welcome they always did. He was, after all, one of America's most beloved actors, someone who had earned respect not just for his performances, but for his professionalism and integrity throughout his career. He settled into the guest chair with the relaxed confidence of someone who had done this routine countless times, completely unaware that Colbert was about to turn what should have been a promotional interview into a personal attack. Colbert's opening was deceptively smooth. He welcomed Damon with his trademark smile, made a few harmless jokes that got the expected laughs from the audience, and began what seemed like a standard interview. But those who knew Colbert well could see the signs. The smile never quite reached his eyes. His questions, while seemingly innocent, were carefully crafted to lead somewhere specific. He was setting traps, and Damon, still believing this was a friendly conversation, walked right into every single one. The first sign that something was wrong came when Colbert shifted away from the movie entirely. Instead of the expected questions about Damon's character or the filming process, Colbert brought up a charity event from 2 years prior, where Damon had made some comments about the entertainment industry that could be interpreted as critical of certain political movements. It was the kind of statement that had been reported at the time, discussed briefly, and then forgotten by everyone, except, apparently, Stephen Colbert. Damon tried to redirect the conversation back to the film, laughing off the question and making a self-deprecating joke about how actors probably shouldn't be taken too seriously when they venture into political commentary. It was the kind of graceful deflection that had served him well throughout his career, the mark of someone who understood how to navigate potentially tricky waters without making waves. But Colbert wasn't interested in letting it go. Instead of moving on, he pressed harder, rephrasing the same question in a way that made it impossible to deflect again. He brought up specific quotes, took them out of context, and presented them to the audience as if they were far more controversial than they actually were. The audience, trusting their beloved host, began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what they were witnessing. Damon's confusion was visible. This wasn't the interview he had been promised. This wasn't the friendly conversation his publicist had assured him it would be. He found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to defend statements that had been perfectly reasonable in their original context, but were being twisted into something else entirely by a host who seemed determined to paint him as something he wasn't. The tension in the studio was palpable. The crew members exchanged glances, unsure of whether they should intervene or let this play out. The The producers were frantically trying to figure out what had happened to their carefully planned show. And the audience was beginning to realize that they weren't watching entertainment anymore. They were watching something much more uncomfortable, something that felt personal and vindictive. What made it even more disturbing was Colbert's technique. He maintained his jovial television persona, even as he launched increasingly personal attacks. He smiled as he misrepresented Damon's positions. He laughed as he set up gotcha questions designed to make his guests look foolish or out of touch. It was a masterclass in passive-aggressive television hosting. And it was happening live, in front of millions of viewers who had tuned in expecting comedy and entertainment. Damon, to his credit, tried to maintain his composure. He attempted to clarify his positions, to provide the context that Colbert was deliberately omitting, and to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But every attempt was met with another attack, another mischaracterization, another effort by Colbert to score points at his guest's expense. The breaking point was approaching, and everyone in that studio could feel it. It came when Colbert decided to bring up Damon's family. Not in the usual lighthearted way that talk show hosts typically do, asking about kids or sharing funny parenting stories that audiences love. Instead, Colbert referenced a private school. Controversy that had briefly touched Damon's children years earlier, something that had been resolved quietly and respectfully by all parties involved. But Colbert had done his research, and he knew exactly how to weaponize even the most personal aspects of his guest's life. "Matt, I have to ask you about the situation with your daughters and their school," Colbert said, his voice taking on that mock, serious tone he used when he wanted to seem like a real journalist rather than a comedy host. "Some people might say that your actions there showed a certain level of privilege that most parents don't have access to." The studio went completely silent. Even the crew members who had been moving around during the commercial breaks stopped what they were doing. This wasn't political commentary anymore. This wasn't even aggressive interviewing. This was a deliberate attempt to drag a man's children into a public confrontation for the sake of television drama. Damon's entire demeanor changed in that moment. The polite professional actor facade dropped, replaced by something much more authentic and much more dangerous. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried a weight that made everyone in the room pay attention. "Stephen, I came here to talk about a movie. I agreed to this interview because I was told it would be a conversation about my work. But you seem more interested in attacking my family than discussing anything relevant to why I'm actually here." Colbert, rather than recognizing that he had crossed a line, doubled down. He leaned back in his chair with that smug expression his viewers knew well, the one he used when he thought he had scored a particularly clever point against a political opponent. But this wasn't a political opponent. This was a guest who had come onto his show in good faith, and Colbert was treating him like an enemy to be destroyed. "Well, Matt, when you put yourself in the public eye, when you take positions on political issues, don't you think your actions in all areas of your life become fair game for discussion? I mean, you can't have it both ways, can you?" The audience was completely silent now. They had come expecting laughs and entertainment, but instead they were watching their beloved host systematically tear apart a guest who had done nothing to deserve this treatment. Some of them were beginning to realize that something was very wrong with what they were witnessing. Damon looked directly at Colbert, and when he spoke, every word was measured and deliberate. "What I think, Stephen, is that there's a difference between legitimate questions about my work or even my public statements and what you're doing right now. What you're doing is personal. It's vindictive, and it has nothing to do with entertainment or journalism." But Colbert wasn't backing down. If anything, Damon's pushback seemed to energize him, as if he was feeding off the conflict he had created. He leaned forward, his smile becoming more predatory than welcoming. "Oh, so now I'm the bad guy for asking tough questions. Isn't that interesting, Matt? You come on a talk show. You want to promote your movie, but you don't want to answer any questions that might be a little uncomfortable. That's not how this works. Tough questions." Damon's voice was rising now, and the cameras were capturing every moment of his growing frustration. "Tough questions would be about my acting choices, about the themes in the film, about the creative process. What you're doing is trying to create controversy where none exists, and you're dragging my family into it for no reason other than your own entertainment." The production team was in full panic mode now. This wasn't going according to any script they had ever seen. The producers were debating whether to cut to commercial, but they also knew that what was happening was compelling television, even if it was completely inappropriate. The ratings would be incredible, but at what cost? Colbert's response revealed just how calculated this entire ambush had been. He didn't miss a beat, didn't show any sign of backing down or acknowledging that he might have gone too far. Instead, he pulled out a piece of paper from his desk, something he had clearly prepared in advance. Actually, Matt, since you brought up what's appropriate to discuss, I have some quotes here from interviews you've given over the years. Let me read a few and see if you still stand by them. What followed was a systematic destruction of context. Colbert began reading statements that Damon had made in various interviews, but he was reading them without any of the surrounding conversation that would have made their meaning clear. He was taking sentences out of lengthy discussions and presenting them as if they were complete thoughts, as if they represented Damon's full position on complex issues. Each quote was followed by Colbert's own interpretation, his own spin that painted Damon in the worst possible light. And after each mischaracterization, he would look directly at his guest with that same smug smile and ask, "Do you still believe that, Matt?" Damon tried repeatedly to provide context, to explain what he had actually meant, to clarify the circumstances under which those statements had been made, but Colbert cut him off every time, interrupting with another out-of-context quote or another loaded question designed to make him look foolish. "Stephen, this is ridiculous," Damon finally said, his frustration boiling over. "You're taking things I said in completely different contexts and trying to make them sound like something they're not. Anyone can make anyone look bad if they're willing to manipulate quotes the way you're doing right now." The audience was shifting uncomfortably in their seats. They had come to see their favorite host be funny and charming, but instead they were watching him behave like a prosecutor trying to destroy a defendant. Some of them were beginning to boo, not at Damon, but at their own host's behavior. Colbert seemed to realize he was losing the audience, but instead of pulling back, he decided to go for the kill. He set aside his papers and looked directly at Damon with an expression that was pure malice, disguised as television friendliness. "You know what I think, Matt? I think you're upset because for once in your privileged life, someone is asking you real questions instead of just letting you promote your movies and collect your paycheck. I think you're not used to being challenged, and you don't like it." The studio erupted, not in laughter or applause, but in a kind of shocked murmur that rippled through the audience like a wave. Even Colbert's most loyal fans couldn't believe what they were hearing. This wasn't comedy. This wasn't even tough interviewing. This was personal cruelty being broadcast as entertainment. Damon stood up from his chair, and when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that cut through all the television artifice and reached every person in that room. "Stephen, I've been doing this for over 20 years. I've been asked tough questions by real journalists, by critics, by people who actually care about getting to the truth. What you're doing isn't journalism. It isn't entertainment. And it sure as hell isn't comedy. It's just mean-spirited. And I'm not going to sit here and let you continue to attack me and my family for your own twisted satisfaction." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time since the interview began, Stephen Colbert looked genuinely rattled. He had clearly expected Damon to continue playing the polite guest, to absorb the abuse, and try to deflect with humor, the way most celebrities did when faced with hostile questioning. He hadn't counted on Damon actually fighting back with real conviction. But Colbert's moment of uncertainty lasted only seconds. His television persona kicked back in, and he tried to regain control of the situation with that condescending tone he used when he wanted to make someone look unreasonable. Matt, please sit down. You're getting a little emotional here. I think maybe you're taking this a bit too personally. We're just having a conversation." "A conversation?" Damon's voice was incredulous now, and he remained standing, looking down at Colbert with an expression that mixed disgust with genuine disappointment. "Stephen, you ambushed me. You brought me here under false pretenses. You attacked my family, and you've spent the last 15 minutes trying to destroy my reputation with deliberately misleading questions. That's not a conversation. That's an assassination attempt." The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. This had gone far beyond uncomfortable television. This was a real confrontation between two men, and the cameras were capturing every moment of it. The producers had given up any pretense of controlling the situation and were just letting it play out, knowing that whatever happened next would be talked about for years. Colbert's mask slipped completely. The jovial television host disappeared, replaced by someone who was clearly angry at being called out so directly in front of his own audience. When he spoke, his voice had an edge that his viewers had never heard before. "You know what, Matt? Maybe you're right. Maybe this isn't a typical interview, But let me tell you something about conversations. Real conversations involve being honest about who you are and what you believe. And what I believe is that people like you, people with your level of wealth and influence, need to be held accountable for the things you say and do. Held accountable. Damon's laugh was bitter and completely without humor. By who? By you? What gives you the right to hold anyone accountable for anything? You're a comedian, Stephen. You tell jokes for a living. You're not a journalist. You're not a prosecutor. And you're certainly not some moral authority who gets to decide what people should be held accountable for. The audience gasped. In all the years Colbert had been hosting late-night television, no guest had ever stripped away his pretensions so completely and so publicly. He was being exposed as exactly what Damon said he was, a comedian who had let his platform go to his head and started believing his own hype about being some kind of important cultural voice. Colbert's response revealed just how deeply that accusation had cut. He abandoned any pretense of being the reasonable host dealing with a difficult guest and went straight for the throat. At least I'm honest about what I am, Matt. I don't pretend to be some blue-collar Boston guy while living in a mansion and sending my kids to elite private schools. I don't lecture people about social issues while benefiting from the very system I claim to oppose. At least when I'm a hypocrite, I own it. There it is, Damon said. And his voice was quiet again. But it carried perfectly to every corner of the studio. There's the real Stephen Colbert. Not the character you play on television. Not the charming host who pretends to care about his guests, but the bitter, resentful person who uses his platform to tear down anyone he decides doesn't deserve their success. The crew members were openly staring now. This wasn't just a heated exchange between a host and guest anymore. This was one human being completely dismantling another's carefully constructed public persona. And it was happening live on national television. Colbert tried one last time to regain the upper hand, to turn the audience back to his side by painting Damon as the unreasonable one. But his voice was shaking now. Whether from anger or humiliation, no one could tell. You can attack me all you want, Matt, but at the end of the day, you're the one who can't handle a few tough questions. You're the one who's melting down on live television because someone dared to challenge your perfect image. Damon looked around the studio, taking in the shocked faces of the audience, the uncomfortable expressions of the crew members, and the panic of the producers who were frantically trying to figure out how to salvage this disaster. When he turned back to Colbert, his voice was calm and final. Stephen, I've answered tough questions from real journalists all over the world. I've been challenged by people who actually knew what they were talking about and had legitimate reasons for asking. What you've done tonight isn't journalism. It isn't entertainment. And it sure isn't comedy. It's just cruel. And the sad thing is you seem to think that makes you important. He started to remove his microphone, but he wasn't finished yet. The final blow was still coming. You know what the real tragedy is here? You have this incredible platform. You have millions of people who trust you, who invite you into their homes every night, who look to you for humor and insight and maybe a little bit of hope. And instead of using that gift responsibly, instead of bringing people together or making them laugh, or even just treating your guests with basic human decency, you choose to use it to feed your own ego and settle your own petty scores. The microphone came off, and Damon set it carefully on Colbert's desk. The gesture was deliberate and final, a clear signal that this interview was over, regardless of what the host wanted. This isn't television anymore, Stephen. This is just sad. And with that, Matt Damon walked off the stage, leaving Stephen Colbert sitting alone at his desk, in front of a studio full of shocked audience members and a television crew that had no idea how to handle what they had just witnessed. The cameras kept rolling for another few seconds, capturing Colbert's face as he realized that his attempt to destroy his guest had backfired completely, exposing him instead as someone who had let his power go to his head and forgotten the basic principles of human decency. The show went to commercial, but the damage was already done. In the span of 20 minutes, Stephen Colbert had revealed himself to be everything that was wrong with modern celebrity culture. Someone who used his platform not to entertain or inform, but to feed his own ego at the expense of anyone who dared to cross his path. What started as a routine promotional interview had become a masterclass in how power corrupts, how fame can turn even the most seemingly likable people into something ugly, and how sometimes, just sometimes, someone has the courage to stand up and call it out for what it really is. So, what do you think really motivated Stephen Colbert's attack that night? Was it jealousy, political differences, or something deeper? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reveal the truth behind the celebrity facade.